Would you like to hear it from the horse's mouth? Horse can spill the beans. If any of you guys can translate these, then we can call it a day. Idioms like these are notoriously hard to translate. True, they sometimes have equivalents that convey the same message, but as many of us might painfully know, that's not always the case. We can search for substitutes for hours on end, but just come up empty-handed. Imagine the amount of trouble the first translators of Shakespeare had to go through, or how stressful simultaneous translation jobs can be. You know, when all the leaders of the UN meet at these summits and conferences, they don't all speak the same languages, do they? You see many of them wearing earpieces or headsets, and all the content is translated to them in live time. Imagine how stressful that is. Could any of you translate beating around the bush or facing the music? I'm sure many of us know the meanings to these phrases, but it's almost impossible to translate, right? Translation is a tough job. And now that we've more or less established how tough it is through these idioms, I can finally begin my TEDx talk. If we don't do this in Reno, we're in Barney, said Basher, explosives expert from the famous movie Ocean's 11. Now, I've been studying English for many years. I dare say I'm fluent, but when I first heard this phrase, I was lost. And apparently, so were the translators that worked for the streaming services in my country, Georgia. So this phrase, we're in Barney, led me on a big search in the World Wide Web, in the internet. And in the end, I found a solution. I arrived at something called Cockney rhyming, slang phrases from East London, where the guy Basher came from. So it goes something like this. The whole phrase is Barney rubble, which means trouble. And there are other phrases like lemon and thyme, bread and honey, apples and pears, and they all have their equivalents, right? They rhyme with something. But as you can see, some of the words are crossed out. So East Londoners are in the habit of shortening the phrase, and they isolate the meaning of the word to the non-rhyming part. So for example, trouble would actually be just Barney, and bread would be money, and so on. So imagine the amount of trouble and hustle a translator has to go through just to find this out, just to find out that we're in Barney in some East London slang means just we're in trouble. Right? And imagine for any tourist, for any outsider who doesn't know that this is mutually agreed upon, it'll be almost impossible for them to understand just any of this. What further fueled my interest was my study of Latin, which I began this year. It's true that Latin is dismissed as a dead language nowadays, but I think that prefixes, suffixes, and roots from the language can help us out a whole lot. It can almost be like a deciphering machine to find out the meaning of words through etymology, and the same applies to ancient Greek. For example, take the word otorhinolaryngologist, right? I'm sure we've all paid that doctor a visit at least once. But if we dissect the word and we take it into chunks, then we get ear, nose, throat, study, and expert. Okay, it makes total sense. Someone who's an expert at studying ears, throats, and noses, right? Same with pediatrician and ophthalmologist. So ancient Greek and Latin are great and all for translating, but does everyone get the chance to learn it? Or does everyone want to learn it at all? Hardly. It's hardly the case, actually. So thankfully, there are other ways to deal with translation troubles. But before mentioning them, I'd like to give 3 famous examples of mistranslation. Our first example begins with US President Jimmy Carter. In the 70s, he paid a visit to Poland, and since he doesn't speak Polish, they hired a translator for him, Stephen Seymour, and supposedly he spoke Polish very well, but we don't know how well he translated. At the airport, Jimmy Carter began his speech, and he said, "When I left America," and Stephen Seymour translated it as, "When I abandoned America." When Jimmy Carter said that he had an interest for Poland's desires for the future, well, Stephen Seymour said that, well, the US president has an interest in Poland's lusts for the future, which sent a very wrong message to the Polish people. And there are many other gaffes he made throughout the speech. But as we can see, lust and desire and abandon and leave, right? Those 2 pairs are similar in meaning, but they can't be used interchangeably, right? So this is the thing with translation. The thing is that true, the words have similar meanings, but they can't be used interchangeably because they change the tone and the meaning of a phrase. And what a translator does best is adjust to these intricacies. Our next example is about Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. also around the same time, and also at the Polish embassy. So there's something about Poland and mistranslation. He gave a speech, and it was addressed towards the West. And towards the end of the speech, he said the words, "We will bury you." And it was translated literally, and it was interpreted literally as well. And for some time, the West thought that Khrushchev was going to do some crazy stuff. He's going to nuke everyone. He's going to start a war and actually bury everyone. But he almost followed up by shipping certain goods, mainly missiles, to Cuba in the 60s. But that's a different topic. So what he really meant was, well, this whole thing was translated incorrectly. It was translated word for word. We call this verbatim in the translating world. So the translator didn't take into account the context of the speech and the intricacies of the Russian language. So in the speech, he didn't talk about declaring war to anyone. He mainly talked about ideologies. So what he really wanted to say was that, well, socialism, the idea of the Soviet Union, was better and could outlast capitalism, the idea of the West. So a more accurate translation of this could be, "We will outlast you. We will be at your funeral," something like that, that isn't as aggressive in tone. And our final example is about the famous brand Pepsi. It was very popular in communist countries, and they wanted to expand their market in China. And they had this phrase, "Come alive with Pepsi generation." They wanted to encourage youngsters to drink more Pepsi. It's the new wave, it's the new move, and so on. And well, they had to translate the slogan into Mandarin. Well, I'm no expert in Mandarin, but somehow they managed to pull something like, "Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the dead." And it was widely advertised in China. And in China, where ancestors are very much respected and revered, it wasn't that appetizing, was it? And so the whole sales strategy completely failed with Pepsi. So to say the truth, I'd be telling porkies if I said that there's a universal cure-all method for these translation misfortunes. But I believe that I, having read many of the same books in different languages, having tried translation myself, though I'm not the best at it, can propose a few remedies or solutions that can help at least alleviate the problem. When we think about studying a language, is it just learning all the words in the dictionary, or is it something more? Studying a language, especially for translators, is, yes, learning all the vocabulary, but also dealing with slang, new grammatical form, and new things that are introduced in languages all the time. A language is a living thing. It's evolving, it's changing all the time, dropping old forms and gaining new ones as well. And what better place to practice multilingualism than, well, the place that most of us go to every day, which is school. Yeah. So one solution I have is for us to found translator clubs, establish translator clubs at school, or maybe include more translating exercises when studying a language. I mean, translator clubs, yes, obviously they make the general translating skills of the member better, but it does something more as well. It spreads awareness and it fosters a relationship between the member of the club and the language they're studying. So at the very least, what it'll do is that it'll prevent blunders like US presidents admitting for their lust for Poland. And my other solution is for those who don't want to translate themselves per se, but want to contribute differently. For example, translating apps are on the rise. I mean, who goes to a foreign country anymore with dictionaries this thick and asks around for directions, right? Everyone uses translating apps. You type whatever you want, you speak whatever you want. The results are fairly accurate, to say the least, but it could do some improvement, you know? And for example, slangs could be added, or new words, or maybe even a new language can be added. Thousands of languages are spoken on a daily basis, even though there are like only 200 countries or so. So I believe that if teenagers, youngsters, and everyone works together to solve multilingual puzzles, then, well, I think fewer words will be lost in translation. Thank you for your attention.